Alright, class. Now, I understand this isn't the most ideal scenario to go over the practical aspects of the Olympic lifts, but we have to make do with what we have based off the current events. Now, the reason why I wanted to go over Olympic lifting is because I know some of you all will be working with high-level athletes or even yourselves who want to improve sport performance. Now, there's a large body of scientific research to show that by utilizing the Olympic lifts can definitely help improve sport, not just for the Olympic lifts themselves, but also increase power output and sport performance just based off these movements. Now they've compared these Olympic lifts to traditional style training, and they noticed that there's obviously higher force outputs. And one reason being is that if you've gone through the manual and if you also read the other scientific article that I posted, one thing is, if you kind of recall back to when you took physics, is Newton's third law, which is for every action there's an opposite and equal reaction. Now, what I'm getting at with that is, if I want to improve performance for, say, sport, I need to derive more force from my extremities, ideally my feet, if we're talking about running or agility. Now, one thing with Olympic lifting and why that's so useful is that because you use high forces with high velocities, and therefore you have high force outputs. Now, recalling back to the highlights that I had you guys use from the manual, is that whenever you do Olympic lifting, there's typically a first pull and then there's a second pull. Now, when you get to that second pull, we call that the power position. And the power position is key for you guys to understand when it comes to teaching the progressions for Olympic lifting or its derivatives. One reason why that's so important is because your torso or your body, and also the weight that you utilize, you are at a position within the segments of your body biomechanically to have a better mechanical advantage for whatever forces that you're trying to overcome. For instance, right now you're seeing myself demonstrate what we call the power position. Basically, my torso is somewhat upright, my knees are slightly bent, that bar is positioned somewhat over the mid part of my foot. That's not a perfect power position, but that's ideally what it's supposed to look like. And in this position, I can overcome the weight faster, more so than, let's say, if it was right here. Mainly because the segments of my body are extended or opened up more to where I can create more force. Hence, why it's important to understand the typical teaching progressions for Olympic lifting. Now, one thing I want to start before I actually go into the actual teaching progressions, keep in mind that these are also in the manual as well, is that you need to learn specific grips. Now, the first one I want to discuss with you is called the hook grip. Like I said before, the hook grip, well, let me back up. There are a couple of different grips that you can utilize when doing the Olympic lifts. And here you see what we call a standard grip, which is basically you grasping the bar with your finger and your thumb, or what we call a hook grip. And this is ideally something that you will teach your clients or your athletes to overcome the forces that are derived from your extremities to overcome the weight. One reason why I say is because when the thumb is wrapped around the bar, as you exert force from that second pull, there's a large amount of forces that are applied to the bar or your hands, and then what happens is if they don't apply a hook grip, that bar easily slips from their hands. Now, you might be saying, why don't you just use wraps? Well, essentially, when you start going overhead and you need to dump the bar, ideally you don't want to have wraps on the bar because it can be somewhat dangerous. You want to be able to get away from that bar as fast as possible. So the first thing is that you need to know is the hook grip, and that's basically you're wrapping your thumb around the bar and then grasping it with your fingers. Now let's actually talk about the teaching progressions. Now, one thing I want to discuss with you guys, the only thing I have right now is a snatch video, but you can use the progressions I'm going to show you and also tailor it to the clean as well as also the derivatives. Now, which I've also posted on a Word document. So let me just kind of break this down as how it should go. Also, it's advisable for each one of you guys to read through the manual to see how you would position your hands on the bar when you actually start performing this. I'm not going to test you guys on that, but that's just for reference for future use or yourselves in your own training. So, like I said before, probably the most important part of the Olympic lifts is teaching this position called the power position. Again, that's where you can derive the most force to overcome an external weight and drive force to the ground. It's very similar to what you see in running mechanics as well. When you see an actual video, it's almost the legs are almost extended similar to what you'd see a power position. Obviously unilateral instead of bilateral. Anyways, going back to the progressions, first you would start with the power position. From the power position, you would teach them to go into what we call a power snatch. So you drive that weight up into overhead, or if you were teaching to clean, you would drive it into the rack. And the rack is just where the barbell sits up high on your shoulders and in almost up close by your neck. Now in this video, I'm taking it into a squat. Ideally, you would not do that. You would go into a power snatch where you just catch it overhead without dipping down. So the first part via USAW guidelines is power position to power snatch or the rack if you're doing a clean. Next, now if you're teaching this, next thing you'd go is you start power position. Then you go into the next position called mid-knee. Again, remember the whole idea is breaking it down to teach this stuff. So you're going to start from what we call a top-down approach. So power position, mid-knee, back to power position, and then power snatch. So that's the second teaching progression. Going into the third, we'd go power position, mid-knee, to the floor, mid-knee, power position, and then power snatch. So that is your third teaching progression. Again, if you lose it, just refer back to the Word document. And the last two is power position, mid-knee, floor, mid-knee, power position, power snatch, and then you'd actually have them go into an overhead squat. Now once they master those individual segments, you would then fully progress them to the full lift itself. That way they get the gist of it, and I'll show you what that is. So kind of me going through this position, and if you're ever unclear about the setup, just refer back to the manual. Now there's a lot of technique that's involved in the Olympic lifts, and not always would you need to go into the overhead or any kind of jerk progressions. Now with that said, you can always go into the derivatives where you're essentially just working on exploding from the power position, and that's also very beneficial for sport. For instance, if you're doing a derivative, maybe you would just start from the floor, come up, and explode from the power position right there, and that's where you would end the movement. Ideally, we're trying to make better sports. We're trying to increase sports performance, not necessarily make them better Olympic weightlifters. Now, one thing I want to make note is how to miss. Now, I'm not showing any videos on this, but let me just give you an example. Whenever you're doing a clean, it's pretty simple. You would advise yourself or the client or athlete you're working with, if you're ever doing a clean, you're just going to push the bar away from you and then get your knees out of the way. It's pretty simple. You don't want that bar to land on top of you. However, anytime that you go overhead, for instance, when I go here, you want to advise your client or whoever we're working with to always have their arms fully extended. Reason being is you want your ball, if your arms are fully extended, every time if your arms are fully extended, you'll miss your head. So anytime you go overhead, you want to keep your arms locked out, and that's also in the manual. If you have any questions, just refer to the manual or then ask me directly via email. Again, guys, I apologize for the circumstance that we're in, but we have to make do. So refer back to this and read the manual thoroughly.